A while ago, I introduced the concept about adding salts and sugars to eggs to make a better quality of egg after they've been freeze-dried or frozen. Now, since I've done that, a lot of other websites on YouTube have kind of piggybacked that idea that I introduced a while ago. Now, the reason for adding salts and sugars to eggs for a better quality product doesn't affect the egg white, it deals with the egg yolk. Proteins inside of the yolk have a tendency to bind together when they're frozen, and when they're reconstituted or thawed out, the proteins are kind of goopy and globby and kind of coagulated, and you just don't have a really good product at the end. Now, you can use sugar, you can use salt, corn syrup, but we're going to focus in on the salt. I received a lot of feedback from viewers about using sugars and corn syrups, and it's just not a healthy practice. So we're going to take a look at the amount of salt added to eggs. Now, the current standard is 1 teaspoon per cup of egg. So we're going to take a look at that and see what happens when salt is reduced. Now, obviously, we can't reduce the salt down to 0 because that's going to give a poor quality of eggs, but we're going to take a look at a full teaspoon, 3/4 teaspoon, half teaspoon, and 1/4 teaspoon, and see if there's some kind of a happy medium in there where we can reduce the salt content. At a full teaspoon per cup, the eggs can kind of come out salty, so if you're going to make a scrambled egg, it's kind of salty and doesn't taste quite as well as with that level of salt. So I have a whole bunch of eggs here. We're going to beat them all up, and we're going to introduce the salt in a new way to see if we can make a bigger impact upon the proteins in the egg yolks. I mixed up all my eggs, and they're all divided into separate measuring cups, 2 cups in each container. I have 2 teaspoons of salt here, and I have 1/2 cup of hot water. Now, this doesn't have to be half a cup, it can be a full cup or whatever, but what I believe will be better is, instead of adding the powder to the eggs and trying to mix it up that way, it's going to be easier for a liquid to be dissolved into a liquid. So I just have a 1/2 cup of water right here. Now, it doesn't matter if we put water into our eggs, because if you're going to be freeze drying it, all that water is going to come out. So I'm going to take a 1/2 cup of hot water, and I'm using hot water because a powder will dissolve into hot water better than cold water. I'm going to take my 2 tablespoons of salt. Remember, we're doing 1 tablespoon per cup. This is 2 cups, so we're using 2 tablespoons for 2 cups over here. And we're just going to mix this up into a liquid, because a liquid will mix with a liquid better than a powder mixing with a liquid. Now, if I was doing a big batch of eggs, I'd be having a big huge bowl, and I'd probably use a cup of water or something along that line. But this will be able to mix with the eggs a lot better than a powder. So we're going to take that, we're going to put that in with the eggs, and we'll mix this up. Now, if I was doing this, if I was freeze drying, say, 8 dozen eggs, I wouldn't be stirring it with a spoon. I'd be using an electric mixer in a big bowl. So I now have my salt introduced into my eggs on a 1-to-1 basis, 1 teaspoon salt per 1 cup of eggs. So in this case, I got 2 teaspoons of salt into 2 cups. And I have my tray here, and I have it marked. This is going to be the 1 teaspoon per cup tray. I'm going to put the tray in the freezer, then I'm going to pour my eggs into the tray and pre-freeze it for the freeze dryer. And just as we did before, the next batch is going to be with 3/4 teaspoon per cup. So here I have 2 times 3/4 teaspoon. We're going to go ahead and add that together with the hot water. and make a liquid form here. Stir this up. And we're going to go ahead and add it to our eggs. And I have this tray marked 3/4 teaspoon, and we'll go ahead and pour this in and pre-freeze this. Then of course comes the 1/2 teaspoon of salt per cup. So in this case I got the 1/2 teaspoon ratio. I'm going to add that and the hot water. I'm going to mix this up. And then we're going to go ahead and pour it into our 2 cups of eggs. So this is going to be a 1/2 teaspoon of salt per cup of eggs. So this is half of the original salt used in the original recipe. And we're going to pour that in the tray in the freezer. And the last ratio we're going to do is 1/4 teaspoon of salt per cup of eggs. Although I've been using teaspoons or measuring spoons to measure out the salt, I've been also going with 1 teaspoon of salt equaling 6 grams in weight. And so 1/2 teaspoon would be 3 grams and 1/4 teaspoon would be 1.5 grams. So that's a little bit more accurate. So this is going to be the final tray at a 1/4 teaspoon of salt per cup. And this is we'll put this into the freezer, and once everything is frozen up, we'll go ahead and start our batch. All 4 trays are in the freezer pre-freezing, and I just want to take a moment to answer a couple of comments I've received on my YouTube channel. Now, some people have asked, well, what if I mix the salt and the sugar together? Would that help balance out the salt? Salt is a flavor enhancer. Salt is added to ingredients to bring out the flavors of other foods, of other ingredients. And just like my wife likes putting salt on her watermelon because she says it makes watermelon taste sweeter. I can't stand doing that. So to those who want to add the 2 together, what's going to happen if you add the salt and sugar to your eggs? The salt is going to bring out the sweetness even stronger in the egg solution than sugar alone. And so I'd recommend do not mix the 2 together because it's going to magnify the sweetness of the sugar. And there are a lot of people out there that have also commented about not using sugar because their belief is that sugar, not so much as a poison, but the sugar just isn't good for you. And I can probably agree that we all can use a little bit less sugar in our lives. So don't mix the 2 together. Either use the salt in savory cooking or use the sugar in sweet and bakery cooking, but don't mix the 2 together. These are the salted eggs right out of the freeze dryer. So I have eggs that were added 1/4 teaspoon per cup, 1/2 teaspoon cup, 3/4 teaspoon cup, and the regular 1 teaspoon per cup. We're going to go ahead and take these out of the trays and get ready to rehydrate them and then see how much the egg yolk proteins have bonded or coagulated. All the eggs are freeze dried. I have the 1/4 teaspoon, the 1/2 teaspoon, 3/4 teaspoon, and the 1 teaspoon. So we're going to go ahead and rehydrate this. Now remember we started with 2 cups of eggs. So I'm going to go ahead and rehydrate everything back so it's 2 cups of final product. And then we'll filter them and see how the yolks held up and which one will go through the strainer the best. All four of these were lightly mixed. We're going to go ahead and test them, and then we're going to mix them with an electric mixer and see if that improves the quality of the product. Now I have two strainers. One is a very fine mesh strainer and one's a little bit more coarse. So we're going to pour them through and see how it works out. The first one we're going to do is a 1 teaspoon salt per cup and see how that comes. Now, this should be the standard with the full strength of salt to see how well it keeps this from coagulating, so to speak. Okay, so this is the coarse strainer. This is the fine strainer. So this is with the 1 teaspoon per cup formula. You can see that there's still a little bit of stuff in the bottom of the screens, and we'll continue on with the rest of them. Next is a 3/4 teaspoon. And you can see that there's quite a bit more material with the 3/4 teaspoon. Next is a 1/2 teaspoon salt. And getting a little bit more. And finally, we have the 1/4 teaspoon. This has the least amount of salt out of all the eggs. And you can see there's even more with the 1/4 teaspoon. There's quite a bit. So this is all mixed by hand, but now we're going to use a blender in all 4 samples and see how mixing it, if that will change anything. So I mixed each of these for 10 seconds on the same speed, and now we'll try the sieves again. So this is our 1 teaspoon sample after everything has been beaten. So you can see there's very little particulates in here, just a little bit of froth. And this is 1 teaspoon. Next is a 3/4 teaspoon. And that had about the same amount of froth as our 1 teaspoon sample did. Next is our 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And that has a little bit more froth in this one, but the solids, very little solids on those ones. The next is the 1/4 teaspoon sample. And it looks like we're having this being consistent on the same amount of foam or froth on here. So all of them, after beating with a mixer, has shown to have the same characteristics of all samples. There's really no particulates left in the sieve. So far, what we've learned is that adding salt does reduce the amount of larger particulates after this has been frozen or freeze-dried. Once we mixed it with an electric mixer for 10 seconds on a medium speed, all the eggs have kind of come through the same. There's really not any particulates left in the sieves, and we all have the same amount of foam or froth in each sample. So now the question is, how are they going to taste? I took a half cup of each solution and made scrambled eggs. I didn't add any butter. I did spray the pan lightly with 4 pumps of oil. So all the oil is exactly the same, no seasoning. So these are the eggs as you have it. All of these eggs were cooked on medium-high heat. So this is the number one. This is the 1 teaspoon eggs, and all the eggs look exactly the same. So we're going to try the taste on this one here. Now, one thing I can say, the eggs taste quite creamy, and it is salty. It's not quite so much salt that it's not, it's not bad. I mean, it is salty, but not so much salt you can't stand it. Now this is the 3/4 teaspoon. So we're going to try one of these here. Eggs are, I want to say the eggs taste buttery, but I didn't use any butter. I'm having a hard time tasting the salt difference between these two. These taste equally as salty. Now this is a 1/2 teaspoon. Creamy texture. I can still taste the salt. Now I just want to try one of these and taste this one compared to that other one. Yeah, I can tell that this one has much more salt than this one. Okay, now we have the 1/4 teaspoon eggs. I really can't taste the salt in this one. I'm sure what I should have done, I should have made some eggs without any salt at all for comparison. Has the same kind of creamy buttery texture. So it is possible to notice the difference in salt content as we go from the 1 teaspoon to the 3/4 teaspoon to the 1/2 teaspoon to the 1/4 teaspoon. You can definitely tell the difference in the salt content. Now, so you might want, the question may arise, why put salt? Why put 1 teaspoon of salt in the eggs if you can beat the eggs with an electric beater and basically get the same outcome? Well, it's pretty simple, and then maybe I can explain this to you. Is just because you beat the eggs with an electric beater doesn't mean that the bound proteins separate. The proteins, as we go from the 1 to 3/4 to 1/2 to 1/4 teaspoon, more proteins will bind together with the less amount of salt that you're using, and those proteins remain in a bonded state. When you're mixing them with a mixer, you're not unbinding the proteins, you're just making the larger proteins into smaller proteins. The proteins are still bound together. Now, in making scrambled eggs, you may not notice a difference, but if I wanted to use these eggs in, say, a souffle or some kind of bakery dish where the beaten egg is extremely important, and I think the best way I can describe it is if you're going to make creme brulee, which uses the yolks without using the whites, you'd probably notice a difference. So the question is, should you or should you not use salt? I think if you're looking for egg quality, you should continue to use salt. Now, if you plan on eating scrambled eggs with the salt, maybe you want to throttle back the salt to maybe the 1/2 teaspoon formula. You can eat these eggs without any problem, and you really don't notice the salt. Now the proteins are still going to be bound a bit, but not as much as the 1 teaspoon strength. If you're going to be using your eggs in doing a lot of baking and in cooking, where the recipes call for salt anyway, well then I would go for the 1 teaspoon per cup ratio. So the salt does increase the quality of the eggs. As you throttle back the salt, more and more proteins are going to be bound, and that is going to change the texture of the eggs. And if you beat them with electric beater, the eggs will come out with less bound pieces, but they'll be smaller bound pieces. I hope that makes some sense. So anyway, I hope you learned something, and I hope this answers a lot of the questions that you guys have out there on whether or not you should use salt and sugar and how much salt should you use. So this information originally came from the American Egg Council. They're the ones that suggested this in the first place, and I'm sure they went through all this long ago to find out what is the best egg to make with salt. Yeah, still a little bit salty. So thank you for your time. I hope you learned something. Please subscribe to the channel. That makes it possible for me to continue doing research on freeze drying. And remember, go forth and freeze dry the world, and I'll get you another video soon.